I just wrapped up the most amazing 10-day vacation of my life via sunny beaches, refreshing drinks, zero stress. Meanwhile, back home, my HOA president neighbor was losing it. She spent those same hours yelling at my garage door, calling the cops, and hiring not one, but 3 locksmiths, all because her car was stuck inside my garage. She had no clue I was watching her meltdown live on my phone from 3,000 miles away. Honestly, best entertainment I've ever paid for. I didn't even need Netflix. Has anyone else had their parking spot stolen? Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. Extra points if it was a power-tripping hoe officially, because this isn't just a story about a stolen spot. It's about ego, entitlement, and what happens when the wrong person thinks they own the neighborhood. So, buckle up. Here's how this whole fiasco began. My name's Connor Walsh. I work from home repairing computers, and nothing fancy, just fixing laptops and setting up networks for small businesses. I bought my house in Maplewood Heights about 2 years ago, a quiet little subdivision where everyone mostly keeps to themselves, or so I thought. The house came with a 2-car garage, but since I only own 1 car, I used the other bay for storage in my workshop. Life was pretty calm until last Monday morning. That day, I heard a weird rumbling sound coming from my garage. I stepped out, expecting maybe a raccoon or some animal, but instead, there was a silver Honda Civic parked right in the second bay, like it belonged there. It wasn't even blocking anything important, it just sitting there clean and new, with one of those stick figure family decals on the back window. I stood there for a solid minute, wondering if I was dreaming. Nope, definitely a stranger's car in my garage. First thing was to find out who owned it. I walked around to the front and scanned the street. Most neighbors were gone to work, but I spotted an older woman watering her garden in the house right across from me. I'd seen her before but never talked to her much. She lived with her daughter, who I'd heard was some sort of whole big shot. Turns out, that daughter was Deborah Langstona, and I was about to learn just how entitled she really was. I knocked on their door, and after a few minutes, a woman in her late 30s answered. She wore faded yoga pants, a wrinkled t-shirt, and her hair looked like she just rolled out of bed. But what really caught my attention was her fascia look that said I was a huge inconvenience just by existing. Before I could say a word, she crossed her arms and gave me a cold, judging stare. "Hi," I said, trying to be polite. "I'm Connor, from across the street. I think your car's in my garage by mistake." She didn't even flinch. Instead, she stepped out on the porch, slammed the door behind her like she was gearing up for a fight. "Oh, honey," she said with a tone so condescending it made my skin crawl. "I am the HOA president. I know exactly where I'm allowed to park." She said it like she was royalty. I kept my voice calm. "It's my garage. It's on my property." Then she actually laughed like I'd told the funniest joke ever. "Show me the paperwork that says I can't use unused community space," she challenged, pulling out an old garage door remote and waving it like a trophy. "Until then, I'm parking here." End of story. Watching her wave that remote, something clicked in my head that wasn't my remote. Both mine were sitting on my kitchen counter. She was using an old one, probably left by the previous owner, to open my garage without permission. She wasn't just being entitled, she was trespassing, using stolen property. Just then, a man in his mid-40s walked over from next door, kind eyes but looking worn down, like he'd been dealing with headaches for years. "Morning, Connor," he said, extending a hand. "I'm Walter Griggs, retired vet. Sorry about this mess." He glanced at Deborah, who immediately snapped, "Walter, this doesn't concern you." Walter just smiled sadly and looked back at me. "Last year, she made me tear down my bird fountain because it didn't meet community standards. Took me 20 years to get it right. She had it removed in a week." Deborah's face turned red. "That fountain was an eyesore, Walter. You know that. Some people just don't get community standards." Then she turned back to me, confidence shining. "Look, Connor, I'm parking there until you learn to share community resources properly. Maybe this will teach you some social responsibility." With that, she stormed inside, slamming the door. Walter and I stood there silently for a moment. "She's been like this since her divorce 6 months ago," he whispered. "Lost her big house in the settlement, had to move back in with her mother, She's been taking it out on the whole neighborhood. I thanked Walter and walked back home, mind spinning. This wasn't just a mix-up or a neighborly spat. Deborah Langston was using her hoe role as a weapon to bully me. Deborah saw me as an easy target, as someone she could bully without consequences. She had no legal right to park in my garage. She knew that perfectly well. She was just banking on me being too passive to stand up to her. At that moment, I realized exactly who I was dealing with. Time to give Deborah exactly what she wanted. The next morning, I woke up to find her silver Honda still parked in my garage, but she'd also left behind a McDonald's cup and some crumpled napkins on my workbench. The nerve was almost impressive. She wasn't just occupying my space, she was treating it like her personal storage and trash bin. That wasn't even the worst part. Checking my email, I found a message she had blasted out to every resident in the Maplewood Heights HOA. The subject: urgent. Neighbor refuses to share parking, a community safety concern. The email was a masterpiece of lies and manipulation. Deborah painted me as antisocial and potentially dangerous, accused me of hoarding community resources, and claimed my so-called aggressive behavior toward HOA leadership was putting families at risk. She portrayed herself as a concerned leader trying to protect the neighborhood from a difficult resident who just couldn't grasp basic cooperation. The whole thing was packed with official-sounding jargon and fake legal references, clearly meant to intimidate the neighbors and make them think she knew exactly what she was doing. I printed out every page of that ridiculous email and taped them all over my garage door like an art exhibit. At the top, in big black marker, I wrote, "Local HOA president demonstrates modern gaslighting techniques." If Deborah wanted to play the public opinion game, fine, I'd give everyone a front row seat to the truth. But I wasn't done. I had a much better plan brewing. While Deborah spread her poison through the neighborhood grapevine, I went online researching smart garage door systems. Thanks to my computer repair background, I knew a thing or two about electronic security. I'd been thinking of upgrading my old garage opener anyway. I found exactly what I needed: a high-end smart lock system that could be controlled remotely via phone app and programmed with custom timers. Perfect for someone who might want to give a trespasser just enough rope to hang themselves. I ordered it with next-day delivery and spent that evening poring over installation manuals and programming guides. This was no longer just about getting Deborah's car out of my garage. It was about teaching a lesson to someone who thought her HOA title gave her the right to bully innocent neighbors. Walter stopped by while I was unloading the boxes from my car. When I told him my plan, his face lit up like it was Christmas morning. "You're actually going to lock her car in there?" he asked, barely able to contain his laughter. "Connor, that's genius. She's been terrorizing this neighborhood for months. Everyone's too scared to stand up to her because she threatens fines for the smallest things." He told me about Martha Dean, Deborah's best friend who lived a few houses down. Martha was a real estate agent and Deborah's gossip sidekick. Together, they'd created a climate of fear where neighbors were afraid to even trim their hedges without consulting the HOA handbook first. Installation took most of the next day, but by evening I had a state-of-the-art smart lock system that could be controlled from anywhere in the world. The best part, from the outside, it looked exactly like my old opener. Deborah wouldn't suspect a thing until it was too late. I programmed the system with a special timer. It would work normally for 7 days, then lock down completely until I manually overrode it. The system was armed and waiting, ready to trap her. That evening around 6, Deborah returned from work and went straight to her spot, acting like she owned it. She'd started moving in more personal belongings: an old folding chair, storage boxes, even a small cooler. She was actively turning my garage into her own space. From my kitchen window, I watched her arranging her stuff and testing the garage door, completely unaware that the system had changed. Around 7, she brought 3 friends over for what she called a garage tour. I could hear them laughing as Deborah showed off her improvements. "This is so much better," one said. "Connor should actually thank you for fixing his mess." Another friend looked uneasy and asked, "But Deborah, isn't this technically his garage?" Her answer made my blood boil. "Community property is community property, dear. Some people just need to learn how to share." That night, I sat in my living room with a cup of coffee, watching the live feed from the security camera I'd installed alongside the new lock system. Deborah had no clue she was being recorded as she spent another hour rearranging my tools, setting up what looked like a permanent workspace. She was so confident, so certain she'd won this battle before it even started. But the lock was set, the trap was armed, and all I had to do was wait for the perfect moment to spring it. With the smart lock installed and fully ready, it was time to move on to phase 2 of what I'd come to call Operation Karma. The next morning, while browsing vacation spots, Hawaii kept calling my name. 10 days of beaches, sunshine, and total relaxation, all while I could watch Deborah's world unravel right through my security camera app. It was almost too perfect. I booked a luxury resort package on Maya Oceanfront Suites, spa treatments, snorkeling excursions in the whole 9 yards. It cost more than I'd normally spend on a vacation, but considering the entertainment I was about to get, totally worth it. I programmed the smart lock's timer to activate on day 7 of my trip, giving Deborah just enough time to get completely comfortable and settle into her new routine before the trap snapped shut. The psychological warfare was just as important as the tech. I needed Deborah to think she'd completely broken me, that I was surrendering my garage to her so-called authority. So I crafted the most pitiful, defeated email I could muster and sent it straight to her. "Deborah," I wrote, "you've made your point loud and clear. I obviously don't understand community standards the way you do. I'm going away for 10 days to reflect on my behavior and attitude. Please feel free to use the garage while I'm gone to show me how community resources should really be managed. Maybe when I return, I'll be a better neighbor." The response was instant and exactly what I'd hoped for. Deborah forwarded my email to half the neighborhood, adding her own commentary. "Finally, some people can learn when shown proper leadership. Connor is beginning to understand how community cooperation actually works." She even called Martha Dean over and had her read the email out loud like it was a victory speech. I watched from my window as they stood on Deborah's porch, laughing and high-fiving like they just hit the jackpot. But the real show began the next day, when I had to officially hand over garage access. I walked across the street with my shoulders slumped and my best defeated look, carrying an envelope I claimed held spare garage remotes and access codes. Of course, those remotes were old ones that wouldn't work with the new system, but Deborah didn't need to know that. She was too busy basking in her moment of triumph to ask questions. "I really hope you'll show me how to be a better community member," I said, handing over the envelope with what I hoped looked like genuine remorse. I never realized how selfish I was being with that garage space. Deborah practically glowed. "Oh, Connor, don't worry. Some people just need a little guidance to understand their role in the community. I'll make sure this garage is put to much better use while you're away thinking about your mistake." That very evening, Deborah threw what she called a community improvement celebration in my garage. She invited 15 neighbors, set up folding chairs, and served cheap wine and grocery store cookies. I watched the whole event through my security cameras, listening as Deborah gave speeches about proper resource allocation and effective neighborhood leadership. One guest asked, "Deborah, what if Connor changes his mind when he gets back?" Her response was perfect. "What's he going to do?" I'm HOA president, and I had documentation of his agreement to community oversight. The party was both hilarious and infuriating to watch. Deborah had completely rearranged my workshop, moved my tools around, and set up what looked like a permanent office space: a desk, filing cabinet, motivational posters about community excellence. She was treating my garage like her personal headquarters, already planning regular meetings and social events there. Martha Dean was there too, snapping photos for what she called neighborhood improvement documentation. They were building a case for their takeover, confident they'd conquered the problem property. Walter stopped by briefly but looked uncomfortable as Deborah explained her grand plans to restructure resource allocation across the entire subdivision. The morning of my departure, I loaded my suitcase into my car with deliberately exaggerated sadness, making sure Deborah could see me from her front window. I even threw in some dramatic sighs and shoulder slumps for good measure. As I backed out of my driveway, Deborah waved from her porch with the biggest smile I'd ever seen on anyone's face. She had no idea she was waving goodbye to the last 7 days of happiness she'd have for a long, long time. My flight to Maui was smooth and uneventful. As the plane lifted off, I opened my security camera app one last time. There was Deborah, already in my garage at 8 a.m., rearranging furniture and setting up what looked like a permanent workspace. She was so busy enjoying her victory, she didn't even notice the small red light on my new garage system quietly ticking down the days until her world changed forever. Day 7 morning, paradise. Time for my smart lock to introduce itself to Deborah. The first 6 days of my Hawaiian vacation were absolute bliss. Mornings on the beach, afternoons exploring the island, evenings soaking up resort luxuries I'd only dreamed about before. But the real entertainment came from checking my camera app all day long. Deborah had completely taken over my garage, treating it like her own office and social club. She'd brought in a coffee maker, set regular meeting times with neighbors, and was even conducting what looked like official HOA business right at my workbench. By 7 a.m. every day, Deborah would arrive with her coffee and laptop, settling in like she was clocking in at a new job. She'd rearranged everything to suit her tastes, hung up her own decorations, and even brought in a small fridge stocked with drinks and snacks. Martha Dean was there nearly every day too, and together they transformed my garage into their neighborhood command center. I watched through the security cameras as they made lists of houses to inspect, planned new rules to enforce, and basically schemed ways to make everyone else's lives more difficult. Some of the footage was downright priceless. On day 3, Deborah hauled in a folding table and chairs and hosted what she called a community standards workshop for 6 neighbors. She stood at my workbench like it was a podium, lecturing on proper lawn care and acceptable mailbox designs. The poor neighbors looked uncomfortable, but no one dared challenge the self-appointed neighborhood dictator. By day 5, Deborah was so at home she started leaving personal items in the garage overnight. Family photos on the workbench, exercise equipment in the corner, even clothes hanging where I used to keep my tools. She wasn't just using my garage, she was moving in. On day 6, I caught her giving Martha a tour, proudly showing off all the improvements she'd made and discussing plans to expand her operation into my storage area. But day 7 was going to be something special. I woke up in my oceanfront suite, ordered room service breakfast, and settled onto the balcony with my phone, ready to watch the show. The timer on my smart lock was set to activate exactly at 6 a.m. Hawaii time and 9 a.m. back in Maplewood Heights, a perfect timing for Deborah's morning routine. At 9 o'clock sharp, I watched through the security feed as Deborah approached the garage door, full of confidence as always. She was carrying file folders, a new motivational poster, and even a small potted plant for her desk. She pressed the garage door button with the casual air of someone who'd done this a dozen times, already mentally running through her morning to-do list. The door didn't budge, not even a little. Deborah paused, confused, then pressed the button again. Nothing. She tried the remote several times, growing more frustrated with each press, but the door stayed firmly shut. I could see her lips moving as she muttered to herself, probably trying to figure out what was wrong. Setting down her supplies, she tried the manual over idea, pulling the emergency release cord and attempting to lift the door by hand. But the lock system I'd installed was top tier, designed for maximum security. Once engaged, the door wouldn't open without my personal authorization code. Deborah pushed, pulled, and prayed and nothing worked. It was like trying to move a mountain. After about 10 minutes of increasingly frantic attempts, she pulled out her phone and started making calls. The first call was obviously to Martha Dean, because within 15 minutes Martha's car screeched into the driveway. I watched the two of them gesturing wildly at the door, clearly scrambling to figure out what had gone wrong with their perfect setup. Martha tried her own set of keys and remotes, but as expected nothing worked. They spent the next 20 minutes checking windows, hunting for alternative entrances, and generally acting like the world was ending. Call number 2 went to a locksmith. Around 11 a.m., a van marked emergency lock service pulled up. I watched a patient locksmith explain to 2 increasingly agitated women that he couldn't just break into someone else's garage without proper authorization. "Ma'am, I need written permission from the homeowner," he kept saying, while Deborah waved her hands, insisting she had every right to be there. After about 30 minutes, the locksmith left, probably tired of dealing with what was clearly a lost cause. But Deborah wasn't ready to give up. Call number 3 brought another locksmith, who gave the same explanation and drove away shaking his head. By afternoon, she was on her third locksmith of the day, this one charging premium emergency service fees. Meanwhile, I spent the rest of day 7 lounging by the pool, occasionally checking my phone to see Deborah and Martha taking turns pounding on the garage door, as if brute force might somehow magically open it. The cameras caught every moment of their mounting desperation, from confused frustration, to angry determination, to what looked like the first signs of genuine panic. Deborah's perfect world was starting to crumble, and she had no clue how to fix it. That evening, I treated myself to a sunset dinner cruise, watching the Hawaiian sun sink into the Pacific while 3,000 miles away. Deborah was probably lying awake wondering what had gone wrong with her foolproof plan to take over my garage. Tomorrow would be day 8, and I had a feeling things were about to get a lot more interesting. I was flying home to face the music. I wondered what Deborah had learned during her week of thinking. Day 10 of my vacation dawned bright and beautiful, but I was genuinely excited to head back. The last few days had been endless entertainment via my security camera app, watching Deborah's desperation grow as locksmith after locksmith told her the same thing. They couldn't break into someone else's property without the owner's permission. She'd tried everything, calling the police, contacting city officials, but everyone gave her the same basic lesson on property rights that apparently never made it into Hope President's School. My flight landed at 4 p.m. and I deliberately took my time getting home. I stopped for groceries, grabbed dinner at a drive-thru, even detoured through a car wash, all while watching Deborah pace around my driveway like a caged animal on my phone. By the time I finally pulled into the neighborhood, it was nearly 7 p.m., and quite a crowd had gathered. Word had spread about the garage drama, and it seemed like half the neighborhood had come out to watch the homecoming show. Deborah stood in my driveway, surrounded by the wreckage of her failed locksmith army, tools scattered on the ground, 3 different locksmith business cards crumpled in her fist, and the desperate look of someone whose perfect plan had completely fallen apart. She'd clearly been waiting for hours, like a predator stalking its prey. The moment my car appeared around the corner, she marched toward me with Martha Dean trailing behind like a reluctant sidekick. "You kidnapped my car!" she screamed before I could even step out. "This is illegal. This is harassment. This ISA." She ran out of accusations and just stood there, breathing heavily and pointing at my garage door as if it had personally insulted her entire family tree. I stepped out slowly, still carrying the vacation tan and the relaxed vibe of someone who'd spent 10 days in paradise while his problems solved themselves. "Hi Deborah," I said, as calmly as I could. "How was your week? Get a lot of community organizing done?" The question seemed to short-circuit her brain. Her face flushed red, and she sputtered about property rights, community resources, and how I'd somehow violated every law in the book by locking my own garage. Martha tried to jump in with support, but even she seemed to realize how ridiculous this had become. "Would you like me to open the garage so you can get your car?" I asked, pulling out my phone and opening the app controlling my smart lock. The simple question confused Deborah even more. She'd apparently spent so much time stewing in anger, she forgot the obvious. "The owner has the keys. After you compensate me for my suffering," she demanded, as if she'd been the victim of a grand conspiracy rather than the perpetrator of ongoing trespassing. "I've lost work time. I've paid locksmith fees. I've been emotionally traumatized by your vindictive behavior." The crowd of neighbors grew larger, phones came out, and it was clearly becoming the neighborhood entertainment event of the year. Instead of arguing, I connected my phone to the large outdoor TV I'd set up on my back patio for movie nights. "Before we discuss compensation," I said loud enough for everyone to hear, "maybe we should review exactly what happened here. I think everyone deserves to see the full story." With a few taps, security footage from the last 2 weeks began playing on the big screen. The crowd went silent as they watched Deborah use her stolen garage remote to break into my garage on day 1. They saw her leaving trash, moving my tools, and gradually taking over the space like she owned it. They watched the party she threw in my garage, complete with her speech about how some people just need better guidance to understand their role in the community. Most damning of all, they heard her clearly state that community property was community property and that she had every right to take whatever space she wanted. "Oh my God," whispered Mrs. Peterson from 2 houses down. "She actually threw a party in your garage while you were gone." The neighbors murmured among themselves, the mood shifting as they realized they'd been watching a masterclass in entitlement and manipulation. Martha Dean tried to defend Deborah, but her voice grew smaller as more footage played. Walter appeared next to me, grinning from ear to ear. "Connor, this is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen," he said loud enough for Deborah to hear. "She's been bullying this neighborhood for months, and you just showed everyone who she really is." He turned to the crowd. "Last year, she made me tear down a bird fountain that took me 20 years to build a broken bar just because she didn't like how it looked," Walter said. "How many of you have stories like that?" The floodgates opened. Mrs. Peterson recounted the infamous garden gnome incident. Mr. Davis described a $200 fine for parking his car slightly crooked. A young couple shared how Deborah had denied their fence permit because their design was too cheerful for community standards. One by one, neighbors stepped forward with stories of months of harassment and intimidation. Officer Dylan Kessler, who'd apparently been called to the scene, watched the security footage with professional interest. "Ma'am," he said to Deborah, "you used an unauthorized garage remote to access someone else's property, stored personal belongings without permission, and refused to leave when asked. That's textbook trespassing. Mr. Walsh has every right to secure his own garage as he sees fit." Deborah's last desperate move was to demand HOA intervention, claiming her role as president gave her special authority over community resources. Walter just laughed and pulled out an official-looking document. "Funny thing about that, Deborah," he said, "we held an emergency board meeting yesterday after Mrs. Peterson showed us Connor's security footage. The board voted unanimously to remove you from the presidencia effective immediately. Turns out, abuse of power isn't in our bylaws." The look on Deborah's face when she realized she'd lost everything was almost worth the 2 weeks of aggravation she'd put me through. Nearly 2 days after my homecoming spectacle, I was enjoying my morning coffee in my newly reclaimed garage when Walter knocked on the door, grinning from ear to ear. "Connor," he said, barely able to contain his excitement, "you're not going to believe this." Deborah called Channel 7 News yesterday and claimed she's the victim of a high-tech harassment campaign. They're sending a crew over this morning to interview her about some dangerous cybersecurity expert who's terrorizing the neighborhood. I nearly spat out my coffee. The idea that Deborah thought she could spin this story into a victim narrative was so absurd, I couldn't help but laugh. Then I realized it might actually work in my favor. If a news crew was coming, they'd want to hear both sides, and I had something Deborah didn't: actual evidence. I spent the next hour organizing everything: a security footage, screenshots of Deborah's harassing emails, photos of her belongings in my garage, and witness statements from neighbors describing her pattern of bullying. I also printed copies of the HOA board's decision to remove her, complete with the official vote count and list of violations. Around 10 a.m., the Channel 7 van pulled up, followed shortly by Deborah, who had clearly spent a lot of time prepping for her TV debut. Hair done, makeup on, dressed in what looked like her most professional outfit. Martha Dean was there too, clutching a folder that probably contained her own version of the story. Reporter Jessica Martinez looked like she'd rather be covering real news than a suburban feud, but she set up her camera and began the interview. "Mrs. Langston, you claim your neighbor has used technology to harass and intimidate you. Can you tell us what happened?" Deborah launched into her rehearsed speech about community cooperation and resource sharing, painting herself as a dedicated public servant victimized by a vindictive neighbor with too much technical knowledge. "He trapped my car in his garage using some kind of high-tech security system," Deborah said, managing to sound outraged and pitiful at the same time. "I'm just trying to help our community make better use of shared resources, and he's using intimidation tactics to silence neighborhood leadership. It's cyberbullying, plain and simple." Jessica nodded sympathetically, then asked the question that changed everything. "Mrs. Langston, the garage where your car was trapped, hey, is that your garage?" Deborah's confident expression flickered for a moment. "Well, no. Technically it's his property, But as HOA president, I have oversight of community resource allocation. Jessica raised an eyebrow. So you parked your car in someone else's garage without their permission? From there, the interview went downhill fast. Every question Jessica asked exposed another layer of Deborah's entitlement. When asked about the garage remote, Deborah admitted it belonged to the previous homeowner. When asked about permission, she claimed her HOA role gave her special rights that simply didn't exist. When questioned about the party she threw in my garage, she tried to spin it as a community improvement meeting. Then Jessica turned to me. I walked over with my folder of evidence in my most reasonable demeanor. Mr. Walsh, Mrs. Langston claims you've been harassing her. How do you respond to these allegations? I smiled calmly and handed Jessica a tablet loaded with security footage. I think the evidence speaks for itself. Would you like to see what actually happened? The camera rolled as Jessica watched clips of Deborah breaking into my garage, throwing parties, leaving trash, and treating my property like her personal kingdom. I could see Jessica's expression shift as she realized she'd been fed a completely fabricated story. Mrs. Langston, Jessica called out, can you explain why you're on camera throwing a party in Mr. Walsh's garage while he was out of town? Martha Dean tried to step in with some damage control, but it was too late. More neighbors had gathered, and when Jessica started asking them about their experiences with Deborah's leadership, the floodgates opened again. Mrs. Peterson, Mr. Davis, and half a dozen others shared stories of harassment, excessive fines, and intimidation tactics. The coup de grace came when Walter produced the official HOA board resolution removing Deborah from office. We held an emergency meeting after reviewing Mr. Walsh's security footage. Walter explained to the camera, the board voted unanimously that Mrs. Langston abused her position and violated multiple HOA policies. She is no longer authorized to represent our community. Jessica turned back to Deborah for a response. But it was clear Deborah had realized how badly things were going. Her face flushed bright red as she backed toward her car, desperate to escape. This is all lies, she shouted. He's manipulated everyone against me. I'll sue this entire neighborhood. With that, she climbed into her car and drove off, leaving Martha standing alone with a camera pointed at her. The story aired that evening under the headline, HOA President Abuses Power, Gets Locked Out. The segment featured all the best clips: Deborah's garage party, her interview meltdown, and the neighbors celebrating her removal. The video went viral, shared thousands of times with comments ranging from supportive to downright savage. But the real consequences were just beginning. Deborah's insurance company caught the news coverage and launched an investigation into her professional conduct. Her supervisors were far from pleased to see their employee starring in a viral video about abuse of power and property violations. Within a week, she was placed on indefinite suspension pending a review of her client interactions and workplace behavior. Meanwhile, the neighborhood was finally experiencing something it hadn't felt in months: peace. Walter had been elected interim HOA president, and his first order of business was to wipe out all of Deborah's punitive fines and harassment policies. The community garden was restored, Mrs. Peterson got her gnomes back, and neighbors began talking to each other again instead of hiding from the HOA enforcement police. Deborah still had one last card to play, but sometimes your final move only proves why you are losing the game. 2 weeks after the news crew fiasco, I decided it was time for a proper celebration. I sent invitations to every household in Maplewood Heights for a garage reclamation barbecue, complete with the tagline, "Come celebrate community resources being used for actual community purposes." I set up grilling stations, borrowed tables and chairs from neighbors, and hung a banner across my garage that read, "Garage officially unstolen." The turnout was incredible. 43 neighbors showed up, including several families I'd never met before. Deborah's reign of terror had kept many people from participating in community events, but now, with her gone, everyone was ready to socialize again. Mrs. Peterson brought her famous potato salad. Mr. Davis curated a music playlist. The young couple with the rejected fence brought homemade cupcakes decorated like tiny garages. Walter, in his new role as HOA president, took the opportunity to announce some major policy changes. Standing behind my workbench, which had once served as Deborah's command center, he addressed the crowd. First, We're eliminating all punitive fines for minor violations. No more $200 penalties for parking slightly crooked or having the wrong color mailbox." The crowd cheered. "Second," he continued, "we're implementing a neighbor mediation system. If disputes arise, we'll resolve them through discussion and compromise, not intimidation or harassment." More cheers. "And third," he added, "we're instituting term limits for all HOA positions. No more neighborhood dictatorships." People smiled and relaxed for the first time in months. Then Martha Dean surprised everyone by showing up with a plate of brownies and a formal apology. "I want everyone to know I was wrong to support Deborah's behavior," she announced. "I got caught up in the gossip and drama and helped spread lies about Connor and other neighbors. I'm starting a new initiative called Neighbor Kindness, where we focus on helping each other instead of finding things to complain about." The party was going perfectly until a familiar U-Haul truck pulled up across the street at Deborah's mother's house. Through the windows, we saw Deborah loading boxes and furniture, apparently moving out for good. The entire BBQ crowd fell silent for a moment, watching the final chapter of our neighborhood drama unfold. Nobody went over to help Deborah. Nobody said goodbye, and no one seemed particularly sad to see her go. "Where do you think she's moving?" Mrs. Peterson asked, more out of curiosity than concern. Walter shrugged. Her mother mentioned Deborah found a small apartment 3 states away. Apparently, her insurance job didn't pan out after the news coverage. She needs to start fresh somewhere that doesn't know her story. Just then, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. I read it aloud to the group. "Thank you for stopping her. I'm Deborah's ex-husband. She did the exact same thing throughout our marriage. He targeted neighbors, made enemies everywhere we lived, and refused to see that she was the problem. I tried to get her help, but she wouldn't listen. Maybe this will finally be the wake-up call she needs." That message put everything into perspective. This wasn't just about a garage or an HOA dispute. It was about a long-standing pattern of behavior that had been destroying relationships and communities for years. By standing up to Deborah's bullying, I hadn't just solved my own problem, I had potentially saved dozens of future victims from the same harassment. As the sun set and the party wound down, I found myself standing in my garage, looking around at the transformation. Where Deborah had set up her control center, there were now folding tables covered with leftover food and neighbors chatting quietly. Where she'd hung her motivational posters about community excellence, Walter had placed a simple sign that read, "Neighbors helping neighbors." The young couple with the rejected fence approached me as they got ready to leave. "Connor," the husband said, "we just wanted to thank you. We were actually thinking about moving because Deborah made our lives so miserable. Now we're excited to stay and be part of a real community." His wife nodded. "We learned something important. You don't have to be anyone's victim, even if they hold an official title." As the last neighbors headed home, Walter helped me clean up the garage. "You know," he said, folding chairs and stacking plates, "I've been thinking about converting half of this space into a community workshop. Nothing fancy, just a place where neighbors can borrow tools, work on projects together, maybe teach each other new skills." I loved the idea immediately. My garage, once the source of so much conflict, could become a symbol of genuine community cooperation. Over the next few weeks, that's exactly what happened. We launched a tool-sharing program, started hosting monthly fix-it workshops, and even began teaching neighborhood kids basic repair skills. The space Deborah tried to steal for her own power trip became something much better, a real community resource that brought people together instead of driving them apart. 6 months later, I received an official letter from the Maplewood Heights HOA. Walter had nominated me for the annual Community Service Award, citing my role in restoring neighborhood harmony and proving that individual rights and community cooperation can peacefully coexist. The award came with a small plaque that now hangs in my garage workshop, right where Deborah used to keep her motivational posters about community excellence. Sometimes I think back to that 10-day ordeal and how perfectly everything worked out. Deborah thought she was punishing me by stealing my garage, but she actually gave me the perfect opportunity to teach her about consequences. Smart planning beats loud arguing every time. Communities work better when everyone understands the rules. And speaking of rules, here's the most important lesson I learned from this whole experience. You don't have to be anyone's victim, No matter how official their title sounds or how entitled their behavior seems. Sometimes bullies just need to meet someone who's willing to be smarter instead of louder. Best vacation I ever took, and I didn't even have to leave the country to get justice. Anyone else have horror stories? I'd love to hear how you handled your own neighborhood drama in the comments below. Remember, standing up for yourself isn't just about winning, it's about making sure the next person doesn't have to go through the same thing. We're Ya Stories, and this is just one of many unbelievable tales. Catch more by checking out the next video. We promise it's even wilder.